So for those of you who may not know me, my name is Jennifer Hill. I'm the Bob Baxt AO Professor of Corporate and Commercial Law at Monash Law School, and we are delighted that you're able to join us for today's seminar on the very interesting topic of should Australia permit dual class listings. And we're delighted to have with us as our speaker tonight, Professor Mark Moore, who I've known for many years. Welcome, Mark. He's over in London at the moment, and I guess you've got up early to join us. Thank you for doing that. Mark holds the chair in corporate financial law at University College London, and he's a distinguished fellow and visiting professor at University of Notre Dame in America, Notre Dame to us. He was formerly a reader at University of Cambridge in the Master of Corporate Law, and he works in the field of comparative corporate governance and has been doing some fabulous scholarship on this topic of dual class listings. Mark's going to speak for about half an hour, and then we're going to have our commentator follow on from that, Amanda Harkness. Amanda was at one stage 12 years in the role of ASX Group General Counsel and Company Secretary. She now is a non-executive director on a number of boards, including Eucaria, which is involved in artistic, cultural and philanthropic interests, and also Vodafone's Australian business activities. She is a fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, South Australia State Chair, and a board member of Chief Executive Women. So welcome to you, Mark, and to you, Amanda, and I'm very interested to hear what you have to say. Just for our audience, if you have questions as Mark or Amanda are going along, please put them in the chat box and please identify where you're from. And we'll try to get to those questions in the Q&A section after Mark and Amanda have finished speaking. So over to you, Mark, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good evening, everyone, which feels a bit weird to say when I've just got out of bed. And good afternoon to the one or two people I know are here from Singapore just now. I'm just going to share my screen, which I had a little bit of trouble with in the run through, but hopefully it will go flawlessly just now. Can everyone see my slide?
All good.
You can? Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Excellent. So should Australia permit dual class listings? I feel a little bit uneasy given a talk about Australian corporate governance to an Australian audience, or a largely Australian audience. So please do pull me up on anything that you think I've said which is not quite right. I've no doubt that Amanda or Jennifer will be happy to do that anyway. I should say I gave this talk last week at another university, and it took me 1.5 hours. So this is a very condensed version. And actually, I'm principally focusing on the Australian relevant elements anyway. So dual class shares is a huge issue at the moment. The biggest issue in corporate governance, I would say, at least in the UK. A couple of years ago, certainly it was also the biggest issue in corporate governance in the US. I think it's time Australia joined the party now. And we looked at where Australia kind of fit on this map. Now, I know those of you listening, some have got more specialist knowledge about this area than others. I do want to try and kind of suit everybody. Let me just see if I can... We're all good, Jennifer? Can you see my next slide okay?
I can. What is dual class
excellent.
stock?
Okay. What is dual class stock? Many of you will know this already, but a dual class stock structure, I'm using the American term, in UK and Australia, I guess, would be more familiar with the term dual class shares. A share structure that gives certain shareholders voting rights disproportionate to their shareholding. So essentially, some shares in the company will carry 1 vote each. Other shares in the company will carry a multiple of votes. In the US structure that's typically used, what we might call the Facebook or Google structure, the standard ratio would be 10:1. So essentially what you will have B shares carrying 10 votes each, which will be more or less exclusively held by the founders or controllers of the company. And then you will have A-class shares carrying 1 vote each, which will be IPO'd on the public market and will be held by standard institutional and retail investors. We now see these more and more exotic structures, again, particularly in the US. So now, for example, companies like Alphabet, Google's holding company, now have a third C class of shares, which carry no votes at all. So if you buy a C share in Alphabet, you're essentially staking a bet in your faith in its management, with no real governance, no governance rights at all, no voting rights. Also, we're seeing bigger and bigger vote ratios as well. In some cases, as much as 20-to-1 vote ratios. Again, in the US in particular. So this is becoming a more and more prevalent phenomenon. Now, some well-known companies that have dual-class stock structures, these are not niche startup mid-cap companies, although there are many mid-cap companies that have them, but some of the biggest companies in the world have them, and that's just a few examples of a kind of random group of companies more or less everyone will be familiar with. If I ask, can you see any commonalities between these companies in terms of the types of businesses that they run? One might say, well, there's quite a lot of tech companies in there, which is true. Dual-class stock today does tend to be synonymous with tech, particularly IT, internet businesses. Alphabet are in there. We've got Facebook. We've got Alibaba e-commerce group. Zoom as well, obviously, which we're all on at the moment, but also a couple of very old school media companies in there as well, not least because in the early days of dual class stock, in the early part of the 20th century, media companies were actually one of the main users of dual class stock as a way of trying to preserve journalistic integrity from outside commercial pressure. But in its most recent garb, in its most recent vogue, it tends to be associated with IT companies, with the tech sector. Why do companies adopt dual class stock? In a way, the answer to that question is quite obvious, because the founders or controllers of the company get insulation or protection from outside market pressures. So if you've started an innovative tech company, if you're the next Mark Zuckerberg or Larry Fink or Sergey Brin, and you've set up this innovative company, you want to develop your products and your technologies in the long term over a number of years. You want the capital that you will get from an IPO, from listing your shares in a public market, but you don't want the pressure from shareholders. Therefore, the dual class stock structure allows you to list the A shares, which carry 1 vote each, or in some cases, maybe even no votes at all. You can keep your outsized voting entitlement. And that basically means you get insulation from outside pressures. The pressures will still be there, but the consequences of not responding to them are not as severe, not least because the market for corporate control is effectively neutralized when you have a dual class stock structure. Because the whole point really of the founders or controllers having these outsized 10-to-1 or 20-to-1 votes is so that they can have autonomous control over the business. So that means that basically the purpose of their structure is to give them majority voting power. If you have majority voting power in the company, then, as most corporate lawyers know, you effectively cannot be ousted, because you have ultimate democratic control over the board of the company. So that means that if an outside activist investor, could be someone like Elliott Management or Carl Icahn, wants to try and launch a proxy contest to get control over the business, then ultimately they're going to have to negotiate with you. So if somebody wanted to buy over Facebook, if they could actually afford to, given its stratospheric market cap, if you wanted to buy over Facebook, at some point in time, you are going to have to sit down and negotiate with Mark Zuckerberg. You cannot take over that company hostile, because even if you get all the independent shareholder shares, you're still not going to have majority control. So you basically take the market for corporate control, you take the hostile takeover out of the picture when you have a dual class stock structure. There's also specific reasons I think US companies have increasingly adopted dual class stock as well, which is to do with the increasing centralization of the shareholder community in the US. And this is a kind of structural response to that. But I'm not going to say much more about that because we're more interested in Australia than we are in the US at the moment. Arguments in favour of permitting dual class stock. Well, there is a view, particularly in the US, and people like Jennifer will be very familiar with this view, this kind of contractarian private ordering philosophy, that companies are the best people to design their own corporate governance arrangements. If a company's investors are willing to buy dual class stock or triple class stock or non-voting stock, then more fool them. If an IPO is sufficiently attractive and investors are willing to buy the A-class shares with 1 vote per share, knowing that they will never collectively have control of the company because the founder will always be supreme, they're still willing to buy stock because the company is an attractive enough prospect, then advocates of private ordering would say, well, let them do that. And why should the regulator step in and stop them from doing that by banning dual class stock, like effectively the ASX has done in Australia? So that would be the kind of liberal free market view. And this very much underpins the US approach. And also, I think there's quite a powerful argument today, which is allowing dual class stock for public companies is a good way of keeping or encouraging exciting, innovative, particularly high-tech companies to go public in the first place. The standard route for a high-tech company or another innovative high-growth business that wants to scale up, their standard route today, generally speaking in the world, it's no longer an IPO. The IPO is becoming increasingly less fashionable over recent decades because of all the baggage, the regulatory baggage, the other baggage that goes with it. Nowadays, the standard scaling up route for a high-growth business is typically to either find a willing industry suitor. If you're a high-tech company and you can get Alphabet or Facebook to buy you, like WhatsApp, for example, then you get to cash out your holding without ever taking the company public because it just gets subsumed into this bigger tech giant. I mean, or the alternative is to find a willing private equity investor who'll be willing to acquire control over the company and work with the management to scale up the business over the next sort of 4 to 5 to 6 years. So encouraging more companies to go public by allowing dual class stock structures has been put forward as an argument and as a crucial way of trying to keep public markets relevant to high growth firms. I mean, one might say in response, now we've got this new SPAC phenomenon, this special purpose acquisition company. You can take a SPAC to market as an empty shell with no business in it. And then once you've floated the SPAC vehicle, you can then acquire the innovative tech company, like Bill Ackman has done or is currently doing. That is, one might say, SPACs have kind of reinvigorated IPOs in public markets, but I think they carry their own problems, and I think that's quite a different issue I probably won't go into today. So arguments against allowing dual class stock. Why would jurisdictions like Australia and up until this year the UK prohibit dual class stock for listed companies? And again, really probably quite an obvious point, but it's this idea that Bebchuk and Castile refer to as the agency costs of dual class stock. The idea that where you have a separation of control and cash flow rights, controllers are going to have perverse incentives. If I have, for example, if it's Facebook, to use the old example, Mark Zuckerberg, I believe, has roughly 15% cash flow rights in Facebook. So he gets 15% of the profit, crudely speaking. He gets 15% of the value, equity value, if Facebook is successful. Yet, effectively, he and his associates have majority voting power in that company. So if you've got majority control over a company, but you're only exposed to 15% of the company's effective economic fortunes, you don't have a lot of proportionate skin in the game. That's the argument. Therefore, you might not be as motivated to run the business efficiently as you would do if you had a proportionate cash flow and voting rights. And in the worst case scenario, you might even be inclined to engage in sinful activities. So, for example, you might engage in self-dealing through, for example, tunneling transactions, where you have separate vehicles that you have 100% cash flow interest in, and you divert opportunities or assets to these companies instead. I'm not saying any of the big tech controllers do that in the US, but in some cases, that's an arguable risk. There is an argument to say investors, certainly smaller investors, need protection against these structures, because if you have a so-called hot IPO, like an Uber, or to a lesser extent an Airbnb, or previously a Facebook or a Google, a hot IPO, everyone wants to rush for it, and they don't read the small print, and they're not so concerned about the governance terms of the IPO. So investors in that position arguably need protected. I think the Deliveroo IPO in the UK in London in March, a couple of months ago, in a way kind of refuted that theory, because Deliveroo was a dual class company where investors in the London market just said, no, we don't want it. And it had a catastrophic IPO, lost 31% on its IPO value in the first few days of trading. Okay, that wasn't the only reason it did, but the dual class stock structure that Will Shu had in Deliveroo certainly was a prominent reason. How are they regulated? The US basically allows them. NASDAQ, New York Stock Exchange, very liberal. Since the 1980s, NYSE has allowed these structures. Didn't before for many decades, but has since the mid-1980s. NASDAQ has always allowed them. So in the US, you can have them. You cannot have midstream recapitalizations where an existing listed company tries to convert its shares. But at the IPO stage, or even the secondary public offering or tertiary public offering stage, you can create new shares with any combination of voting rights, as long as your investors are willing to buy them. So that's basically the US position, very liberal, permissive. Australia, as many of you will know, is on the opposite end of the scale, which is why it's a really nice example to use. Ever since the early 1990s, and again, correct me if I'm wrong in my history, but I believe since the early 1990s, ASX listing rules have basically prohibited dual class stock structures for ASX listed companies. I believe, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, there are a small handful of what I'd call legacy dual class stock firms in Australia, which may have been around on the markets before 1993, which may have some variant of a multi-vote structure. But certainly since 1993, the mandatory rule in the ASX has been you must have one vote per share. So Australia is very strict. Australia does not like these structures, crudely speaking. So if you put US on one side of the scale, you got Australia on the other. Now, the East Asian jurisdictions are especially interesting because they, up until a few years ago, pretty much stuck to the Australian stance, which was very much anti-dual class stock. And then they decided, for competitive reasons, the exchanges in the Far East, some of them decided they would shift and to some extent allow dual class stock. So Hong Kong was the first to move in 2017 when it liberalized its listing rules. So the Hong Kong Stock Exchange liberalized its listing rules to allow conditional dual class stock for innovative companies as defined in its listing rules, which basically means tech or biomedical companies, more or less. Mainly because it got burned by Alibaba, because everyone expected Alibaba to list in Hong Kong, but because of Jack Ma's dual class stock structure, they decided to list in NASDAQ where that would be allowed. So Hong Kong decided to change its rules. Singapore followed in 2018 by changing its rules. Singapore got burned in particular by Manchester United Football Club because the Glazer family who run them wanted dual class stock. Originally, they wanted to list in Singapore, but when the Singapore Exchange were quite clear that they would not allow the dual class stock structure, the Glazers eventually took Manchester United to the New York Stock Exchange instead. So again, for competitive reasons, Singapore reformed. China's quite interesting because in China, dual class stock structures are generally prohibited under domestic company law, but they can exceptionally be permitted. And they are permitted for companies listing on the New Science and Technology Innovation Board on the Shanghai Stock Exchange, otherwise known as the STAR market, which has been a rapidly growing market, which is branding itself as the NASDAQ of the East. Although it took a bit of a hit with the controversy with the prohibition placed on Ant Group's listing over the last couple of months, but other than that, it's been rapidly rising. So the Asian jurisdictions were in the Australian position, have shifted a little bit towards the US position, but still with a lot of conditions attached. I won't go through them in detail just now. And now my country here, the UK, is really interesting because the UK is very schizophrenic, really. At common law, and I guess I believe Australia would be the same at common law. At common law, the UK position is you can have dual class stock. As Lord Upjohn famously said in the Bushel and Faith case in 1970, Parliament has never sought to fetter the right of the company to issue a share with such rights or restrictions as it may think fit. But listed companies have traditionally had a very hard job getting investors and investor groups to support dual class stock structures because there's been huge hostility in the London markets to these structures. Then in 2013, London introduced its premium listed sector and its enhanced listing regime, which basically meant that if you're a premium listed as opposed to a standard listed company in London, then you have to follow something called the proportionality principle, which basically bars dual class stock. You have to have 1 vote per share. Then, following Brexit, the UK government wanted to try and make the UK's listing sector more attractive, basically to stop lots of listings going to Amsterdam instead, because they're still in the EU and we are not. And in response, the UK introduced its listing review, otherwise known as the Hill Review, because it was chaired by Lord Hill of Abersock. And Lord Hill recommended in March of this year, a couple of months ago, that the UK allow dual class stock for premium listed companies. So standard and premium listed companies in London should be allowed dual class stock. All the really biggest companies listed in London are premium listed. All the corporate names that you'll be familiar with, the BPs and the Shells, the AstraZenecas of this world, are all premium listed. So premium listed companies, as of the end of this year, assuming everything goes to plan, will be allowed to list on the premium sector. They'll be allowed to list on the premium sector with dual class stock, subject to certain restrictions. So there's a maximum 20-1 voting differential, which really surprised me because I never thought Hill would go as high as 20. I thought 10-1 would be the maximum, because even in the US, you will struggle to list with 20-1, as Adam Newman found out when he tried to list WeWork. Investors were not keen on that, and ultimately that IPO was aborted. Also, there's a 5-year time-based sunset. A sunset is basically a provision in the stock whereby after 5 years, the multi-class votes automatically convert to single votes. So basically, the philosophy is you're the founder, you're the entrepreneur, you've got 5 years to scale up your company after it goes to market, after it IPOs. After 5 years, your multi-vote shares reset to single vote shares and you lose that outsized power. unless a majority of independent shareholders pass a resolution to say you can keep it for another 5 years. There's also additional sunsets based on transfer and resignation. That's in particular to deal with the so-called idiot heir problem, where the founder dies or retires and passes on the business to their children who are completely incompetent at business. Anybody who's watched Succession on HBO, brilliant program, will be familiar with that problem. And finally, Hill recommends a restriction of weighted voting rights to control-related issues only. So only voting issues concerned with appointment of the board or approval of a takeover or merger will be subject to dual class shares. Otherwise, they won't be active. So that's basically where the UK is going. So we've got the US on one side, we've got Australia on the other side, we've got Hong Kong, Singapore, Shanghai Star and Britain moving away from the Australian position a little bit towards, quite a bit actually, quite a fair bit towards the US position. And now the big question, should Australia follow? And that's the question I'm here to give a tentative answer to. But basically this is the concern. Stock exchanges are private entities. They compete with other stock exchanges around the world to attract new listings. How do you attract new listings? Well, you try to appeal to founders or promoters or entrepreneurs by offering them autonomy and flexibility. That's what NASDAQ's done. That's in part why NASDAQ's been so successful. On the other hand, you want to provide sufficient assurances to minority independent investors that their interests will be protected and they won't be subject to self-dealing risk or other agency costs. So to mitigate the cost of capital for companies, you do need to provide these assurances for investors. The top factor has driven NASDAQ and NYSE. The bottom factor has driven the UK and Australia in recent decades. They've both been seeking to secure comparative advantage in different ways. And I think comparative advantage absolutely underlies this. The question isn't, why aren't we all doing what NASDAQ are doing? Because not every exchange is like NASDAQ. Different stock exchanges have a reputation for being good at different things. And I think my kind of discomfort here is every exchange around the world is trying to be like NASDAQ. And actually, the companies that are listed on that exchange and the companies that are likely to list on that exchange in future might not be, basically are by and large a different type of issuer, a different type of company from your typical NASDAQ issuer with very different needs. So different stock exchanges need to appeal to different factors. So, and a good example of this. So Alex Chesterman, the CEO and founder of Kazoo, who are quite a well-known online second-hand car website, and certainly in the UK. Don't know if they've made inroads in Australia, but Kazoo were possibly expected to list in London, like Deliveroo, earlier this year, and decided actually, no, we're going to go to the US, we're going to go to NASDAQ. And I think this quote by Chesterman kind of sums up that point that I'm trying to illustrate. Why go to the UK when you can go to NASDAQ? Companies investing in high growth are just better understood by investors in the US, he says. US investors understand better business investing in the short term for future growth. So you might say, does it matter what country you list in? Because surely investors are international nowadays. So whether you invest in the ASX or the NYSE or the LSE or the NASDAQ or whatever, isn't it the same investors by and large because capital markets are international? Yes and no. Yes, investors have access to all these markets at minimal transaction cost, at least large institutional investors do. But domestic investors within a market still hold a lot of clout. If not in an investment capacity, then certainly in an advocacy capacity. Investor interest groups like the CII, Council of Institutional Investors, or the Investor Stewardship Group in the US, or the Association of British Insurers in the UK, they hold a lot of clout within their markets, and their recommendations do tend to be followed, and they do tend to be very domesticized as well, domesticated, or whatever the word is. So yes, investment markets are becoming more internationalized, but investor voice is still, I think, a very domesticized phenomenon. And as I mentioned earlier, the big spoke in the wheels for London and the Hill Review was the Deliveroo IPO in March 2021, which has been referred to as the worst IPO in London's history. And I mean, I don't know if that's quite true if you look at some of the horrendous promoter IPOs from the 1800s, but certainly in recent history, it can certainly lay claim to be that. I'm quite proud to say I'm one of the only Deliveroo shareholders currently sitting on a profit. They listed at 310 pence, and I bought them at 247 pence about 3 weeks after IPO, and I'm still in profit. I'm proud to say. Don't know how long that will last for though, but it was a disastrous IPO. And one of the reasons was London just didn't buy dual class. There were a lot of other issues with the Deliveroo IPO relating to the big Uber decision of the UK Supreme Court, which cast into question the status of gig economy workers, their employment status, and that posed a big issue for Deliveroo. But predominantly investors I've spoken to privately over the last few weeks say whatever investors say publicly, the dual class structure was the big deal breaker for most of them. Now, I'm going to finish very soon. I know I'm up against the clock, but I do want to tell you about a bit of research I've been doing. And what I've tried to do to kind of join this debate is I've tried to measure what I call the multiple vote stock compatibility of different stock exchanges, taking 4 exchanges in particular as my study, my what's the word, subject group. NASDAQ, now because of constraints, because I've been doing this during university term, I've only been able to look at these exchanges at top 100 level. So I do admit my data sample is narrow, but I am broadening it. So far I've looked at the NASDAQ 100 in America, the NYSE US 100, the FTSE 100 in London, and the ASX 100 in Australia. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to come up with one figure, a number between 0 and 100, a percentage figure, which measures how compatible each of these different stock exchanges, or at least how each of these different indices is with dual class stock. So if an exchange gets a figure of 100, that would be synonymous with 100 of the biggest cap firms, all recently IPO'd, entrepreneurially controlled tech or biomedical companies, whereas a rating of 0 would dictate a stock exchange index fully comprised of clunky, old school, either manufacturers or consumer conglomerates or mining companies or oil or other energy companies, and trying to judge on a scale how compatible a particular index is with dual class or other multi-vote stock. And this is a scoring system I thought up. I didn't think it up actually. I'm trying to use criteria of what constitutes an innovative company that other stock exchanges have used, particularly Hong Kong and Singapore, and criteria those exchanges have taken into account in judging whether a particular company is innovative. And the grading, or the system I've come up with, is to give a company a point for innovation if it's either an IT company, a telecommunications, including internet or social media company, a biomedical sciences company, or a company involved in green energy or automation. The company gets a further point if it's under founder or first generation control, and it gets a further point if it's within 7 years of IPO. The assumption being, the preliminary hypothesis being, that that would be a typical IPO, a typical dual class stock type company that has those characteristics. I then color coded all the different companies according to how many points they had. So the greener the company is on the spreadsheet, the more suited they are to dual class stock. The more warmer in color they are, if they're yellow or especially red, they are not suited to dual class stock. And that's basically the calculus that I'm not going to bore you with as to how I came up with the figures. So that was my hypothesis. And this is the data. Now, I am going to finish, but I really, really want to show you this. And I'm going to share another screen just now. Who will I start with? I'm going to start with NASDAQ, because NASDAQ are like the antithesis of the Australian exchange in a way. So this is NASDAQ. Jennifer, can you see that okay?
Yes, seeing it well.
So this is the top 100 in NASDAQ, the NASDAQ 100. Look at the left-hand grid. The left-hand grid denotes whether they are a dual class stock compatible company. Green means good, yellow means bit iffy, red means definitely not. The right-hand column denotes whether they actually have dual or triple class stock. Now, if you look in particular at the left-hand column, NASDAQ comes up maybe not quite as innovative as you might think. There's quite a few greens in there, also quite a lot of yellow. One of the reasons there's a lot of yellow is there isn't actually that many first-generation control companies, and most innovative tech companies in NASDAQ are beyond 7 years of IPO. So, for example, Apple came up as yellow. We'd all say Apple are an innovative company, but they only come up as yellow because of their control structure and their long time since IPO. But NASDAQ does come up as pretty innovative if you compare it to some of the others. Now, if we quickly shift to, who will we go to next? Let's go to, this is really interesting. I thought the New York Stock Exchange would come up similar to NASDAQ. But if we look at the NYSE, if you can see this, the NYSE comes up as a sea of red. Even though US exchanges have got a reputation for attracting tech companies, that's not true. NASDAQ does. The NYSE is much closer to Sydney or London when it comes to the characteristics of its biggest issuers. It's an old school clunky exchange. It's not an innovative tech exchange. And don't let them tell you otherwise, because the figures just don't show that. And quickly going to London, I'm leaving Australia for last, because that's the bit we're most interested in. London comes up, let me just bring that up. This is FTSE 100, this is London, predictably a sea of red. Ocado Group come up as green. They're actually an online supermarket. They qualify as innovative because their main business is developing online shopping technology, but some might dispute whether they are. So not much innovation or dynamism going on in London. And finally, last but not least, ASX, Australia, another sea of red. Not that much. We got a few greens. We got more greens in the ASX 100 than we do in London. Afterpay came up as a 3. I did this alphabetically. I started with Afterpay and I thought, gosh, Australia's a high-tech, innovative exchange. Then I realised that after Afterpay, it's mainly red. Not least because Australia is similar to London. It's a sector dominated at the top end by mining companies and energy companies. So NASDAQ's the exception rather than the rule. To finish off, I'm now going to distill all of this into figures and have a bit of fun to finish with. So are we back on the slides, Jennifer?
We are.
No. Yeah. So NASDAQ 100, what sort of figure would you expect? NASDAQ comes up with a compatibility quotient of 35%, but 42% when you cap weight it, although much of that cap weighting is being pushed up by Alphabet. And no, it's Amazon. Even though Amazon aren't a dual class company, they have got dual class characteristics. And because they've got a $1.6 trillion market cap, that's pushing up their cap weighted quotient. However, when Jeff Bezos steps down, that 42% figure is going to go down just because of the impact that he has by still being CEO there. So NASDAQ comes up at 42%, but only 26% of NASDAQ issuers actually have dual class stock. So the preliminary indication is that actually not enough NASDAQ companies are making use of the regulatory freedom they have to introduce those structures. NASDAQ's not dual class enough in practice. The NYSE, the New York Exchange, has the opposite problem. The NYSE comes up with an MVS compatibility quotient of with 7%, so a really small figure, but actually 16% of the exchange cap weighted have dual class stock. So too many New York Stock Exchange companies are adopting dual class stock. Although I think that figure's been pushed up quite a bit again by News Corporation and Berkshire Hathaway, but that's an interesting one. And FTSE 100 comes up at 6%. Obviously, no FTSE 100 companies have got dual class stock. Deliveroo didn't take a premium listing, it took a standard listing because it wouldn't have been allowed a premium listing because of Will Shoe's votes. And ASX comes up at 4%, 7% without the cap weighting, 4% with the cap weighting. So London and ASX come up pretty low, but not that different from NYSE. NYSE 7%, FTSE 6%, ASX 4%. What's the indication from that? It's that FTSE and ASX are stock markets whose constituent firms are not suited to dual class stock. And because of the exchange's familiarity of hosting companies that don't have dual class stock characteristics and the related ingrained attitudes of investors in both these markets, then I don't think it's the wisest idea for either of these markets, actually, FTSE or ASX, to consider banning dual class stock. They risk undermining their reputation as high accountability exchanges, concerned with minority investor interests, in exchange for what will almost certainly be very limited benefits. And the fact that arguably one of Australia's most innovative tech companies, Atlassian, chose to list in NASDAQ kind of demonstrates that. And also the Kazoo NASDAQ listing was another big blow to London as well, to say, look, the tech companies, why go to ASX? Why go to LSE when you can go to NASDAQ? So I don't see the value in Australia or indeed London actually changing their rules, even though broadly in principle, I am very sympathetic to dual class structures. I do think I need to improve a lot of things in this study. I do need to improve the data. I need to improve my scoring system. And I know Amanda has got some very critical things to say about the way I think I've scored some of these companies. And I'm fully open to these criticisms. I think I need to incorporate considerations of either research and development or conversely, the extent of stock buybacks in a company as another criterion. And I also would like to incorporate depreciating asset companies as a negative impactor on an exchange's compatibility quotient, thinking in particular of fossil fuel, tobacco and carbon-based production or automation companies. So that's kind of where I'm going. All I want to know at the moment is, first of all, do you buy my argument? And I'm really keen to hear this from an Australian point of view. Do you agree, or do you think I've been a bit mean to Australia in the conclusion I've reached? But bear in mind, I have reached the same conclusion with the UK, and I do think the Hill reforms are arguably misguided. I don't think there's a great case for them. I think they're politically motivated. I think they are Brexit motivated. I don't think they will have an appreciable difference in London. And I think if anything, they will do more harm than good. And I don't want Australia to risk making that same mistake. That's my view. I'll put it on the table. and I will look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say. Sorry I ran a little over there, Jennifer.
Well, thank you, Mark, so much. Australia thanks you for your concern for the country, and that was a fascinating talk. I'm going to pass it over to Amanda now, but if I could just remind the audience, we'd love to have your questions in the Q&A box. If you could just identify yourself and also where you are from, your organisation. Over to you, Amanda. So please tell us what you think.
I'd first like to thank Mark and reassure him that I think Australia's and ASX's interests are in safe hands. Not that I'm an employee of ASX and haven't been for a number of years now, but I think there are a number of characteristics of the Australian market. And there is history, which I know Jennifer's written extensively and analysed very closely the News Corp experience here. But there's not just that, and it's probably helpful just to set it in a little bit of context about the Australian market. It may surprise many of us to just realise that, you know, we are a nation of retail shareholders, even outside our super funds, which are clearly, you know, the biggest institutional investors in this market. And there's a recent survey that was done, which is sponsored by ASX, that shows that direct shares, are the most widely held asset class. And I was surprised by this, because we all in Australia think of investment properties as being a really widely held asset class. But actually 58% population holds shares, direct shares, and 38% residential property. And that's, you know, if you did it by value, it is probably a little different. But the reality is there are 6.4 million adults, so 6.6, I think it is, million adults who are voters who directly hold shares. And so these aren't just matters for an exchange to decide, or even for regulators. It's also something that our past history tells us can very quickly become a political issue in Australia. So I think there are a lot of interested stakeholders who would look at any proposal by ASX to introduce, you know, this class of share. Mark, there are a few things that you said which I think I can probably fill out a little bit. There are certain circumstances in which ASX does actually allow, and since I think the early 2000s, a number of large agricultural cooperatives, excuse me, have actually been allowed to, am I still there, Jennifer?
Yeah, no, all good, yeah.
Have been allowed to use a dual class structure, and that's really to bring not entrepreneurial companies to the exchange, but to bring the more conservative companies where you have growers and, you know, other members. So there've been, you know, dairy, grain companies, which have been quite, you know, significant companies that have come to listing to the exchange. And there's a whole guidance note that deals with that and the circumstances, and the way that ASX deals with it is to say, well, the founders of these businesses and the members of the cooperative may be concerned that coming into the listed market may mean they'll lose control too quickly before the market really understands the companies, and also to allow them to make a transition, because often they're very significant enterprises when they do list. And so that means there's quite a well-developed framework which encourages those businesses to move to the public markets. So that you might find those useful and interesting examples to dig into a little more. the question that I always like to ask in these circumstances is, what is the problem we're really solving for? And, you know, are Australian investors, you know, missing out on an opportunity here? Certainly, there are, ASX prides itself, I think, and certainly markets itself as being very friendly to tech companies. But of course, they're all at the smaller end. And as you rightly point out, the Atlassians do go to NASDAQ. It's much more than the dual class listing structure, which encourages them to go there. And Afterpay has recently signalled that, you know, it's likely to be heading that way. But that's as much about accessing a customer base, you know, a brand presence, indices in the US, as it is, I think, about the voting structure of the shares and the control that enables companies to have. Most of the tech companies on ASX are in the 300 index or below. And it's interesting, you know, we think, is ASX losing out because it doesn't have this class structure? Well, ASX has approached it a bit differently and introduced a few other mechanisms. It's certainly got its 300 index, which for the larger tech companies, one of ASX's value propositions is you can get into that index much sooner on ASX than you can on NASDAQ, you know, get into a relevant index. And that's worked. I think there's certainly more than a handful. There are 47 US companies that are listed, foreign companies that are listed on ASX. ASX has also been very successful in marketing to Israeli companies and listing those, and through Asia, and Singapore is one of those jurisdictions where ASX has been successful in bringing some tech companies to list here. And, you know, the reason, and that was obviously before the dual listing structure, but the reasons are more about the risk appetite of the local market, and also the index inclusion. And in Australia, the super funds provide such a deep liquidity pool. You know, that's very, very attractive to many in this region, and a very different attitude to investing. We've got 6.6 million adults who, you know, readily invest in shares, are very interested. There's something I've read in the last week that says 1 in 2 Australian adults visited the ASX website in the last 12 months, which I found astounding. They probably also went to realestate.com, but it just shows the level of interest.
Amanda, could I just ask a quick question? The 6.6 million Australians investing, this is people investing independently of the super funds then? Yeah,
that's right. And of course, the super funds in the last, you know, if you look at the last 5 years, 10 years, there's been more than a doubling of their presence in the market, and that will continue to grow. And it's, you know, that deep liquidity pool here is something that's very attractive. So yes, this is outside, and it's also, you know, if you look at it in terms of demographics and younger people, the trends that are happening there are even more interesting. You know, women are really growing as investors in terms of their presence, and under 25s, the percentage of under 25s is starting to invest because it's so easy. You do it on your phone. I mean, I do it on my phone. Certainly since ComSec set up an online platform in the mid-90s, the growth in retail investment's been quite pronounced, and the way in which people behave has been, you know, changed. I'm happy to send you something, Mark, which we can do offline on that. So ASX really hasn't lost out. It's still doing incredibly well in attracting tech stocks. At one stage, it was describing itself as the NASDAQ of Asia. I don't know that that's used anymore. I don't know that's the right sort of description to use. But I think the index, the new index that's been created called the All Technology Index is really interesting, and that's been crafted to and designed to appeal to very, you know, more early stage companies that won't even get into the 300 index, and so attract them and pull them through. The ASX recognises the Atlassians are going to go to NASDAQ, and certainly, you know, we've seen that, and we've, you know, News Corp, of course, provides the infamous example to us of the deep interest that all Australians and Australian politicians can have in the structure of our markets, because the structure of our markets and the market integrity of our markets, the fairness, I suppose it's the fairness principle between one share, one vote, is something which certainly in the past has got traction here, and I think still would. I think that's something that would certainly attract attention. We saw that when Singapore launched a takeover, a merger of equals for the ASX. Very quickly, something as arcane as Australia's clearing and settlement arrangements became of great political interest, and, you know, there was an intervention there. So, you know, is ASX suffering a competitive disadvantage? I would say clearly not, which is, you know, that's demonstrated by the track record that we've seen. It's also, I mean, interestingly, seen through the performance of companies. I've seen a survey which showed that Australia's technology stocks, which have the acronym WAX, the WAAX, compared to the FANG, actually have performed better in terms of gross capital gain over, you know, 2020, which I was surprised by. But you know, it's obviously coming off a small base and coming from an IPO experience. The couple of other points, just quickly, wanting to allow plenty of time for questions. In Australia, of course, ASX isn't the only exchange venue. There are two others, and I think if there was really demand for this class of security here, those exchanges, which don't attract the same public attention or regulatory attention, would certainly be venues that would have a basis to argue the case. One of the big challenges, I think, for an ASX would be, and this is ignored in the private ordering argument, it's all well and good for, you know, an IPO to say there's been a lot of disclosure around the structure and the rights, but it's really the post, you know, the secondary trading, the post-IPO situation. And again, certainly ASX's memory and perhaps some retail investors' memory would be scarred for life by the experience of Bris Connections. Jennifer, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it was an instalment offer in the, I think it must have been, it was pre-GFC, but so the instalments were sold for, let's say, $1. It floated, so obviously those that picked it up in the IPO should have been very aware that there was actually $2 owing on those instalments. But what happened was, post-IPO, the instos realised that it wasn't going to become commercially viable, withdrew, and a lot of retail investors saw it as a penny dreadful that they might make some money on, piled in, and it ended up, having very large obligations. And that really raised the whole issue within ASX itself of, whether or not these were appropriate form of securities, because whilst there was the disinfected disclosure in the IPO, secondary trading only provides a few extra letters on the stock code, and you have to be well informed to know what they mean. So I would say there's plenty of corporate and institutional memory in our regulators and the political class to mean that dual class shares, except for the very limited circumstances we currently have, are very unlikely to be put forward as a structure that ASX needs to have to be competitive. And I'll be very interested, over time to just see how the experience of Singapore and Hong Kong plays out. I think for Singapore, there's been some disappointment at the ability of that exchange to attract other listings. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not it is a structure that's really adopted and attracts companies to that venue. So Jennifer, I might just leave my commentary there and allow some time for questions.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Amanda and Mark. Now, we've got a number of questions coming through. I'm going to have to pick and choose a little bit because I know we'll run out of time. I'm just going to, Bruce Dyer. Bruce has thanked both of you for an excellent presentation. He makes the point that the ASX has many more companies with greater than a single block holder that's got more than 50% of shareholding than on US and UK exchanges. And he asks, should that have relevance to the approach taken here and make Australia distinct? And if so, why? Anyone want to jump in on that, either you, Amanda, or Mark?
That's a huge elephant in the room that I'm kicking myself now for not thinking about. But I mean, I think if anything, that makes enhances the case for opposition that Amanda's just outlined. I think if you already have a lot of companies getting the benefit of controller of a controller autonomy without dual class stock, then why introduce it? So I think that strengthens the argument.
And when that muscle is exercised, Mark, it enlivens not only commentators like Stephen Mayne and others, but it does attract a lot of attention, I would add.
Okay, now we have an interesting comment here from John Fast. John says, there seems to be an almost implicit assumption in the presentations that DLCs will result in market abuse to the detriment of shareholders. While that is certainly open to discussion, there are many non-DLC companies where abuse has and will continue to occur. He says, I am not sure that I understand the evil that we are trying to prevent, and I don't believe that merely because the ASX has not, quote, lost out, quote, that is a reason to not allow them. Investors follow the successful entrepreneurs. They are prepared to invest in DLC structured companies because they see their fortunes as being aligned with the fortunes of the entrepreneurs or innovators that have created them. Any response to John's point?
I don't think that, and I've written stuff basically kind of disputing that argument, that just because you've got a dual class structure, you will have some sort of abuse. And I mean, the idea that just because you don't have skin in the game as a controller, or you've got minimal skin in the game, you're not going to safeguard your company, I think is just far too simplistic. it takes a very banal view of human nature that, you know, unless every, you know, unless you're fully benefiting financially from every decision you make, you're not going to take good decisions. That's just not the way human beings work. So I don't think that. I actually think, John, that complaint has been massively overemphasized by critics of dual class stock. So I don't think just because an exchange introduces dual class stock, there will be market abuse absolutely everywhere. I don't think that will happen. I think that the bad eggs will be bad eggs, like you say, whether they're dual class or single class. My reason for being skeptical about dual class stock isn't so much at the company level, it's more at the exchange level. What sort of message are you giving out? One of the main reason London banned dual class stock in its premium sector about 8 years ago was because we had a lot of Eastern European, Eurasian, former communist bloc energy, natural resources companies listing in London, where investors were skeptical about the level of protection they would have. And this was a big assurance London gave, just to say, look, you're in safe hands. So I think a lot of this is about signalling and messages. But no, I don't think there's some terrible evil, but there's a lot of evil controllers just waiting to abuse their investors. But if you read some of the academic literature, I think you'd be led to believe that.
I think in relation to the argument that John is critiquing there, I think Lucian Bebchuk really took that approach in relation to Alibaba. I mean, he just said, you know, the whole of America is going to be fleeced by Alibaba. Amanda?
Look, I don't think it's about a investor's understanding, and also so if you look at the Australian market, who are the big investors? They're the super funds, and retail, you know, has a larger presence than other markets, and online, you know, online access to markets is now terribly easy. We've all got it on our phones. And those investors that really do understand and perhaps have, you know, the fear of missing out, of attaching to these entrepreneurs, can easily do so by trading on those other markets. So I think there are other, you know, I certainly don't think that it necessarily means that there'll be abuse. I agree with Mark that bad eggs will be. Certainly some individuals attract a lot of attention when they seek to have those powers, and their influence through the media can be questioned. So hear what you're saying, and that's not that's certainly not where I think the objection comes from here. Yeah,
it's a long time, Amanda, since I ever had reason to look at when the ASX investigated whether to introduce dual class stock at Rupert Murdoch's bidding before he moved News Limited to become News Corp in Delaware. And I just can't remember the ASX's major reasons for, you know, rebuffing the...
Well, I think the ASX was a very different organisation, enterprise at that time as well. The political climate was a different one as well. So I think it's a long sort of bow to draw to go back to that example. I don't think that, I think it's more helpful to look at, well, what's ASX done to promote itself, to attract listings? And, you know, I think it's probably quite mature as an organisation, recognising it's not going to compete with NASDAQ or NYC. I mean, there are many other reasons. Inclusion in, you know, the S&P 500 was probably a much bigger reason for Rupert to make the decisions he made.
Yeah. I know the Asian Corporate Governance Association is quite unhappy about the spread of dual class stock through Asian exchanges, and I think hopes Australia doesn't go down that route. But we have another question here from Helen Bird from Swinburne University. Helen, thanks for your question. She said, "Hi, Mark, and thanks for your really interesting paper. Should we assess the attractiveness of this proposal about internal control of companies on a criteria that has nothing to do with control and governance? We need to encourage listings, particularly of technology companies." And then she asks this question, which is interesting: what about the corporate governance issues that arise in the longer term when you have an entrenched founder in charge of companies?
Yeah, I mean,
does this make sense? Which I think it does. Yeah.
I mean, that issue Helen mentions at the end of her comment is a particular motivation for these sunset clauses, which seem to be becoming the kind of vogue now internationally, at least with exchanges that have allowed dual class stock. So I know Singapore and Hong Kong are both very big on sunsets. And I mean, I know Bebchuk has written quite a lot about this. And, you know, he's a big concern that while a new tech company might be really attractive and really dynamic over the next 7 or 10 years, after then the market moves on and they become a more mature company, and actually they don't have the same need for dual class stock. And do you want to be stuck with legacy dual class stock forever? And that's been put forward as one of the reasons for having these sunset clauses. And I think there is, I think that's quite a convincing argument. I'm not a great fan of time-based sunsets, just because I think it's impossible to determine what an appropriate time period is when a company transitions from a growth company to a mature company. That could be 3 years, 7 years, 15 years, 25 years, just depending on the company. The idiot air problem, for want of a better word, I think is a major problem. Because when you buy dual class stock, usually you're putting faith in an individual. You're buying shares in a company, but you are making a bet on an individual, whether that's Will Shu or Jack Ma or Mark Zuckerberg or whoever. And when that individual leaves the picture for whatever reason, then you haven't placed that bet in their descendants. And I think that's a powerful reason. I don't think that's an argument against dual class stock. I think it's an argument for having appropriate sunsets in place. As for Helen's earlier point, balancing, I think it's a balance. On the one hand, there's a competitive drive to get the tech companies listed, which encourages the exchange to maybe overlook. I don't know about overlook. I think the governance issues are always there. I don't think they're ever overlooked, but it's just a question of balance. I think, which is the stronger competitive consideration? Is it getting the tech companies in at high cap level, or is it safeguarding governance? And I think different exchanges will and should strike that balance in different ways, but I don't think it's a one or the other. I don't think.
I think, Mark, the disclosure regime is actually a bigger factor for those companies, and certainly, Australia has a very strict regime. US companies are always amazed when they come here about what they have to disclose and when.
Yeah. Again, that's something, another kind of elephant in the room there. But that's a really good point, Amanda, which I didn't think of, the impact of disclosure.
Yeah, because Australia's regime is quite distinctive. And it takes me back to in the early 2000s when, everyone was flocking to list in the US on the New York Stock Exchange. And Jack Coffey was, running these arguments that the exchanges that had the strongest protection would be like beacons that would attract companies that wanted to show they had the highest levels of governance. And so this is like a new era of that. Mind you, that all ended after Enron, when everybody fled the New York Stock Exchange after Sarbanes-Oxley. But it's got parallel issues to, the competition point against, with exchanges.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the Coffey was still arguing that after Enron, I think, because I think he try and say that, even after all the controversy with Sarbanes-Oxley, that you still had a lower cost of capital, you still had a much higher market cap in America.
You're right. He didn't buy the argument that Sarbanes-Oxley had repelled anyone. I think
by the way,
yeah.
just to mention, if you don't do so already, follow Helen Bird's Corporate Governance, Australian Corporate Governance updates on Twitter. They're amazing.
Oh, well, thank you for that. And I'm sure Helen will thank you for that as well. I think, look, we're getting a couple more questions, but I think we do have to wrap it up. We could keep going on. It's been a fantastic session. Mark and Amanda, so grateful to have you as part of this series. And Mark, I hope you have a happy day in London. And Amanda, wherever you are, I think Adelaide, is it?
Yeah, Ghana land.
Fantastic. All right, and everyone else, I'd like to thank Ellie and Janice and Heather and our marketing team. And we've got another one of these coming up on the 17th of August when Scott Hurst will be joining us from Boston University, and he's going to talk about how much do investors care about social responsibility. So that will also be an interesting next seminar. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.